Audience.
All right. How many of you have ever learned a new language? Maybe you learned a new language for an extracurricular, or maybe you had to learn a new language because you were moving to a different country. And maybe while you moved to a different country, you also had to adapt to a new culture. Well, no matter the reason, I can guarantee you that no one here was ever forced to abandon their language and culture just to learn an entirely new one. In the 1994 movie Nell, this is precisely what happened to her. A young woman was found isolated in the woods, where she was found by a psychologist named Jerry. And this psychologist, along with another one named Paula, made an attempt to teach her English and to civilize her, introduce her into society, and try to make it so that she can be a functioning member of society. But this movie does raise a couple questions for me. Is it possible to civilize a wild child or a wild person? And is it moral to do so? Before I answer those questions, let me ask you one more question. Where do you get your language and culture from? Where do you learn these things? Well, you probably learn to speak when you're a baby. Your parents teach you how to say mama or dada. And then as you grow older, you watch the behaviors of the people around you. You start going to school, you watch behaviors of your classmates, you learn about their interests, and so maybe some of their interests also interest you. And so through that, you develop a culture of your own. You know how to behave, you know how to act, you know what's wrong, you know what's right. I've researched a few similar cases to Nell's from the movie. And these cases are these two particular cases of wild children. One named Victor, found in 1799, and a more recent case of a young girl named Jeannie from the 1970s. And I also researched another case about the Carlisle Indian schools in the late 18th century and early 19th century. So I'm going to begin by talking to you about the two cases of the wild children. The first is Victor. He was found in Aveyron, France in 1799. When he was found in the wild, he was assumed to be about 10 or 12 years old. He exhibited some animalistic traits. So even he didn't speak, but he did grunt, and he waved his arms around like an animal as a way for him to communicate. So he was taken in by a doctor named Dr. Jean-Marc Itard, and this doctor attempted to civilize Victor, who was named Victor after he was found. He attempted to civilize this young boy by teaching him French, but he quickly gave up because he realized that although he was able to mimic the sounds of words, he wasn't able to fully grasp the meaning of these words, and therefore he couldn't put together a sentence to really express his thoughts. He would only mimic the sound for pure pleasure or joy. The second case was the more recent case of Jeannie. She was found in 1970 after having been isolated in her own home for 13 years. She was locked in a room at the age of 20 months, and the only human interaction that she got was when she would receive beatings from her father. So that's the only time that she ever saw another human. And when she was found, she couldn't speak. She couldn't stand upright. She was curled up. She was kind of shy. She appeared shy and frightened. She didn't have any social skills at all. But over the course of 5 years, scientists and doctors and linguists were able to work with her to teach her English, and she was able to learn to speak, and she even developed a few social skills like cleaning herself, clothing herself, even sewing with a sewing machine. And in 1975, she was recorded having a full-on discussion with Dr. Marilyn Rigler from Georgetown University, who is a linguist. And in this recorded discussion, Jeannie was quoted saying, she was talking about a gift that was given to her in class. She said, "Marcia, give me square, in the class, Marcia give me in the class, Marcia in the class. So even though these are not perfect sentences, you can still grasp that she's trying to convey that she received a gift from a girl named Marcia in class. You can still understand what she's trying to communicate. And so she was able to have a conversation, even though it wasn't perfect English. And the last case that I'm going to talk to you about is the Carlisle Indian Schools, which were in effect between 1879 and 1918. So during this time, the Native American children in the U.S. were taken from their homes, away from their families, and they were put in these boarding schools where they were taught how to speak English. They were raised as Christians, and they were forced to dress and appear as what they believed to be a standard American was. So they weren't able to dress in their cultural attire. They had to wear what a standard American wore at the time. And this posed a lot of problems because when these students were sent back home, back to their families, their entire identities and cultures were erased. So they weren't able to socially reconnect with their families. And the ones who were adopted by white Americans, even though they learned their culture, they weren't fully able to assimilate because they felt like they didn't belong. They knew something was amiss. And so an experiment that was meant to integrate Native Americans into American culture ended up failing because it was a genocide of their identities and their culture entirely, and it left a lot of scars that would be felt for generations to come. And I can compare this to the movie because towards the end of the movie, Nell was taken away from her home when she was deemed, her home was deemed unsafe for her. The home that she grew up in this whole time apparently gained too much attention, and she was unsafe there anymore. So they decided to take her away from her home into the city, into the hospital, so that they can further teach her English and study her, learn her language, and assimilate her essentially. And she received such an extreme culture shock that she was put in a catatonic state. She couldn't even speak. And this had a negative effect on her. Like it was a traumatizing event for her. She didn't want to be taken from her home. She just wanted to stay there, but they forced her out, assuming that that was what the right thing to do was for her. And so to sum this presentation, let me show you. To sum this presentation, I believe that it is possible for a wild child to learn English and to learn a new culture if they possess the desire to do so. So in Jeannie's case, and I'll show you by this diagram. Oh, this is backwards. So this is Jeannie, and she's essentially a blank slate. She has no prior knowledge of any language or culture. She doesn't know how to behave. And so when she is taught how to speak and how to behave, she absorbs it easily because she's a blank slate. She has nothing to hold her back, nothing to confuse her. She's not dead set in any old ways that she may have developed. But when we look at Victor's case, he is too far gone. He already is comfortable with his grunting and his hitting and his animalistic behaviors that he doesn't want to change. He can't absorb all this brand new information because he's already dead set in his ways. He can't learn French. He's not comfortable with eating with utensils, or he can't place the meaning of words because he already learned grunting and body language that he uses to communicate with other animals. And so in some cases it is possible, but in others they might be too far gone. And in Nell's case, she was able to learn some English, but in the end they ended up having to learn her language more than she learned theirs, just so they could understand her, because she was too far gone, and she was still able to be in the presence of humans and not act crazy like an animal like Victor probably was, but she still was allowed to speak her own language and live in her own home at the end. And so this brings us to the question of morality. Is it moral? Well, I refer to Victor's and Jeannie's case once again. In Jeannie's case, it was moral because they were saving her, they were giving her personality, they were giving her a culture to base her behaviors off. They were teaching her how to behave after being locked up inside for 13 years. Whereas in Victor's case, he was forced against his will, like Nell, taken out of his environment and placed into something that he didn't want to be a part of. And so it is only moral if they are willing to learn listening language, if they want to be a part of it. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you.